Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. At the top of the program, China has released a white paper on its relationship with the World Trade Organization, also known as WTO. The document underscores the country's achievements since its accession in 2001, as well as its contributions and commitments to free trade.
A milestone for Beijing's reform and opening up program, as it looked to integrate into the global economy. China joined the WTO in 2001, embracing the world with open arms. The white paper gives a full account of the country's achievements since then.
The country's WTO entry 17 years ago set off continuous improvements in the living standards of the Chinese people, rapid economic growth, and more importantly, the accelerated integration of the commercial interests of China and the rest of the world.
The paper outlined that China has regularly been a significant contributor to global economic growth. When it joined the WTO, it was importing goods worth about $250 billion annually. Last year, that figure jumped to nearly $2 trillion. China has also been a magnet for foreign direct investment. In the same period, it increased from nearly $50 billion to more than $130 billion. However, the government holds that China is now in a position to push for much more.
We should insist on equal participation and transparent and open discussions. We must respect the will of the majority of the members and in particular focus on the concerns of the developing countries.
The white paper argues that protectionism and unilateralism are posing severe challenges to the global multilateral trading system. It calls on all countries to share the burdens of globalization and said China is looking forward to future opportunities for cooperation.
So has China proven its fair trade credentials through this white paper and many of the discussions related to it? Let's loop in our panelists. With us in our Beijing studio, we have Cui Fan, professor from the University of International Business and Economics in China, also Deputy Secretary General of China Society for WTO Studies. Professor Cui, welcome to our program. Joining us in Geneva, Switzerland, Ricardo Melendez-Ortiz, the CEO of International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development. What a pleasure to see you, sir. And also from Washington, D.C. in the United States, Jacob Kirkgaard, a senior fellow of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Good to see you once again, Mr. Kirkgaard. Let me begin by asking you, Professor Cui, 17 years, WTO entry. Many say WTO has managed to help a lot of countries, but the question is, who is the biggest benefiter of WTO now? Is China or somebody else?
Okay. It's hard to say, because the trade is good for everyone, and trade should be mutually beneficial to all the WTO members. China has gained a lot from joining the WTO. But if we look at the numbers, for example, when China entered in the WTO in 2001, 21% of China's export was to the United States. But now the number is 18%. But for United States, in 2001, about 2% of United States export was to China, but now the number is 8%. It's a very big increase as well. So, and also a lot of American invested companies in China, they are selling a lot of goods in Chinese market. They are benefactors as well.
Right. Let me go to Mr. Kirkland in the United States. Mr. Kirkland, do you agree with that math that Professor Cui just did for us?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the numbers are not particularly controversial. There has been huge trade growth both ways. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I do think that we still need to, and that I also believe that there's no doubt that China has done tremendously well by joining the WTO. But it is also, of course, a fact that the current political environment in the United States is very negative on this issue, as articulated by President Trump. And I think this has to do with Two big items, basically. First, that in many ways the United States has not done its own homework properly when it comes to continuing to globalize its economy. It doesn't have adequate institutions in place that redistribute from winners and losers from trade agreements, and that sets in motion the political backlash. And then secondly, precisely because of the very successful entry of China into the WTO, I think it's very clear that now the WTO system needs to be reformed, because it is not clear that the WTO is able to actually cope with an economy such as China that is both still very large, a developing country, but also innovation leader in many other sectors.
No one is forcing any country to be within WTO as a member of WTO. Every country volunteers to join, and every country volunteers to remain a part of it. And therefore, let me go to you, Mr. Melendez-Ortiz. I mean, talking about reform of WTO, it's like talking about reform of the World Bank, talking about the reform of the IMF. We remember earlier the discussion was about whether the emerging economies, developing countries really should have what percentage of a say about the international governance system. Obviously, that process has been very slow, and now we are talking about reform of WTO, if according to Mr. Kirkegaard. But we know that within the WTO system, Mr. Melendez, because you are in Geneva yourself, there is a handicapped system because the judges are not still there anymore. There's cases that needs to be, you know, in a way ruled by the judges of the WTO.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to see you, Tian. Let me just put it into context, perhaps, and just before we get there to the last part of your question. The first thing here is to put this again into a historical perspective. So the WTO of today, it's a system that combines the legacy of the GATT system of the post-war with the negotiations in the late 80s and early 90s that gave rise to the WTO, the Uruguay round. Now, in that Uruguay round, already China had applied for accession to the GATT system in 1986, and it participates, but not as a full member. It only becomes a full member in 2001 when the WTO rules and the whole structure is into place. Now, why is this important? Because we have now China for 17 years benefiting from the WTO system. And I would say to your first question, the whole world benefiting from China being a member of the WTO and from the other enlarged membership of the WTO. The GATT system goes from 70-something members to 160-something, 63, 64 today, in those years. And so, but that system, and this goes to your question now, it's a system that is based on rules which were negotiated. That means they're the result of compromises of countries that have competing interests as well as sometimes conflicting interests. Countries go from interest to problem solving, then they get into international cooperation, they design their agreements with mutual benefits in most cases. But that system is based on discussions on an economy of the 1980s at the best. So it was in 82, 86 when the terms of reference for that negotiation that gives birth to the WTO takes place. Now that's, in a way, first is a system that of course continues to be extremely relevant, but it speaks about, to a great extent, to an economy of the 20th century, not necessarily the 21st century economy.
Okay.
Nonetheless, 17 years China has benefited from that membership, and I think I agree with the previous speaker, with Jacob, when he says that we're now in time for an update, an upgrade of those rules.
All right, there is a need.
And that upgrade of the rules has to do also.
Let's just leave some time for some follow-up questions, if we can, Mr. Ortiz of Melendez.
To the global markets.
Yes. One of the questions is, we all understand, WTO is the very bottom line, right? I mean, everybody joined this 160-some member, or organization, and that is the bottom line. That is a very low standards that everybody has to apply to and negotiate it out. The thing is, what kind of aspirations should we need to have? Whether it's about China, whether it's about other 160 members of the WTO. So in that regard, Mr. Kirkgard, when we talk about WTO's future, is it important to single out a country, whether it's the United States or China or the UK, or actually think about what kinds of aspirations do we need to have? And can the current members of the WTO already fulfill the very basic bottom line when we think about aspirations? And by the way, it's common aspiration.
Well, I mean, I think that there's no doubt in my there's no doubt in my mind that the biggest individual problem country for the WTO in the short to medium term will be the United States. I think if you look at the actions and likely actions of this administration, I think we cannot rule out that Donald Trump actually tries to pull the United States out of the WTO. So before we, unfortunately, can get to talking about aspirations for a reformed WTO, there are a lot of domestic issues here in the United States that needs to be settled first, unfortunately. But then, if we assume that the United States does not, after all, leave the WTO, well then, what can we aspire to? Well, I don't think there's any doubt that we need to have some of the older so-called Singapore issues included. Because, I mean, an economy of the 21st century revolves greatly around investment. Yeah, sorry. I mean, basically, big picture-wise, it has to do as much with international investments, FDI, than it does with traditional trade in goods. The second one that I would look for is we need to look at trade and services. But if we look at trade and services, we need to look at common standards. We need to look at behind-the-border barriers and the like. Those are all things that, in my opinion, quite frankly, it is probably unrealistic to expect the entire WTO membership to sign up to, simply because of the difference among the member states. So what I hope we can hopefully aspire to are the so-called plurilaterals, or coalitions of the willing, if you like, that includes the major large advanced economies, China, and as many other developing countries as possible. But as I said, honestly, I am not convinced that all 160 or so members will be able to join these new agendas anytime soon. As
I said earlier, this is going to be the bottom line. So how has China been fulfilling the bottom line? Professor Cui, I want to come back to you. Some say what China's reform and opening up measure has been too little too late. Do you agree with what they said?
Okay. Actually, in the recent several years, China has been doing a lot in opening up and reform. And actually, about 2 years ago, China started to change its foreign investment system from the review and approval system to a so-called recordation system. That means, in principle, in all the fields, China is open to the outside. For any exceptions, China have a negative list. The recent negative list was just published yesterday. And the negative list has been so short, only 48 articles. For all the other industries, China is opening its market to the foreign investors. And actually, I think in 3 years, China is going to fully open its financial market and fully open its automobile market. So I think this is a big deal. Foreigners will benefit from that very much. But yes, I think China can do more. I hope we will do. The government will open our market more wider.
Reform and opening up, of course, has been China's idea, holding on to it for 40 years. Mr. Melendez-Ortiz, what do you make of the current speed? And also, of course, latest negative list, the 22 of them items being listed out. Some say, still, we could be faster, we could be better. What do you say?
I think I agree. You could be faster and you could be better. I think that China has developed a very robust economy, a very competitive economy with world-class companies, with world-class entrepreneurship. I think this is in many sectors, but I think the most impressive and visible one is in the digital economy. And if I may, Tian, let me just say a word quickly about the aspirations that you raised before. We should be aspiring to a World Trade Organization and a global trade system that addresses what Jacob called 21st century economy, 21st century issues. What does that mean? It means a system that has good governance, that enables the digital economy to really distribute benefits to everybody, that deals with issues of today. Any company that participates in the global markets today is digital. We don't have in the WTO meaningful rules and governance of the digital space. But we also are lacking rules on competition policy. We're in global markets and there's nothing really on competition policy. We need to secure, for instance, some of the issues that many countries have raised with respect to the Chinese economy have to do with the behavior of state-owned enterprises, for instance, or with the provision of maintenance of certain subsidies. Well, we have an outdated subsidies agreement in the WTO. That needs to be reviewed. We don't have even a definition of what a state-owned enterprise is in the WTO that can be really used to try to tackle the kind of concerns that some people have. But then we also don't have rules really on investment. We have a very chaotic and very suboptimal system worldwide of investment and investment disputes. That should probably be multilateralized. And so on. You have issues like carbon content in goods, climate change, so on. So you're going to go down a list of pending issues that we should be tackling through cooperation in the WTO.
Mr. Melendez-Ortiz, I mean, are you being a little bit too idealistic? I mean, even the basic structure of the WTO right now and the conflict resolving system, which has been there for decades, are not being agreed upon anymore. And you are talking about a very long-term goal. Are you being too idealistic, even though I think all the points that you are making is extremely important? But you know what, Mr. Melendez-Ortiz, we might be bogged down by the current trade war that is going on, by the current use of tariffs, which is such a backward tool for world trade. We will be bogged down by this. Many of the beautiful goals you talk about will be even further away from where we are today. Mr. Melendez-Ortiz, I want to have your views on this.
You're absolutely right.
As simple as that.
You're absolutely right.
Okay.
And you put before another question to me, which is, but wait, there's a qualifier here. You're absolutely right, but that doesn't mean that we cannot. First, we have the tools in place to confront the current situation, which I think still is in the skirmishes stage. Secondly, I think, and we need to address those issues very urgently, including the question of the erosion of the integrity of the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO.
The dispute settlement of the WTO is extremely important, particularly now when you have trade disputes among countries, Mr. Kirkegaard, that countries have to go to the WTO for the conflict resolving mechanism. That is what's being invented for decades, and that has been working for decades. And now some countries just refuse to go there and say, I'm just going to do it bilaterally. And therefore, the other countries have to respond to this. Otherwise, there's only one country taking advantage of all the other countries that they want to levy whatever tariffs on. So, Mr. Kirkegaard, are we already walking backward, let's just say, compared to where we were 10 years ago, in terms of this international mechanism of resolving trade conflicts?
I mean, I certainly believe we have gone backwards in one very important way, which is that one of the founding members, or indeed, depending on how you look at it, probably the most important promoter of free trade since World War II, namely the United States, has clearly now abandoned that route and instead increasingly forcefully embraced protectionism. And I think, as I said earlier, it is an open question in my mind whether or not the Trump administration will actually try to take the United States out of the WTO. And as a very minimum, I don't think we should expect the Trump administration to adhere to any rulings that go against it from the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. And, you know, given the role of the U.S. and the size of the U.S. economy in the global economy, yes, that is a very significant backward step for the entire system. It doesn't mean the system is doomed, in my opinion, but it certainly is a step backwards.
It is. It is. But at least some efforts has to be made. For example, about IPR protection, before we go, I just want to share with our viewers worldwide some numbers. New data show some improvements of China's IPR protection. I have this on hand. Since 2001, intellectual property royalties paid by China to foreign right holders grew by 17%, reaching nearly $29 billion in 2017. Invention patent applications filed by foreign entities and individuals in China reached 136,000 in 2017, growing threefold compared with 33,000 in 2001. Of course, a lot of numbers going on these days in all of the debates we have involving the global trade system. But for now, I want to thank the three of you for being with us. Cui Fan, Ricardo Melendez-Ortiz, and Jacob Kirkgard. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you.